So welcome everybody. My name is Belinda Decay and I'm Director Emeritus of Stonington Free Library. And it is my honor to welcome you all on behalf of the board library of Stonington Free Library and welcome you to another in our series. And also to welcome all those joining us by live stream from places far and near, which is wonderful to think about. First, I want to thank our staff, Assistant Director Carla Omland and Millie Donovan, who does a great deal of work for our programs. She's our Youth and Adult Services Assistant and a super tech person. And also our program committee of volunteers who do so much to bring these events to our community. These events do not happen just by magic. They take a lot of work and a lot of forethought, and we do appreciate it very much. Our email list, please leave your address at the desk and we will add you. Kind as to silence your cell phones. Thank you. It is my belief that libraries help to create the future by honoring the past and the present. And today we are doing just that by celebrating the 100th anniversary, who is very much part of both our past history and our present experience. The Stonington Free Library could not be more grateful than to have here today as our distinguished guest, Professor David, rights activist. I think it is safe to say, though I'm given to exaggeration, but not in this case. I think it is safe to say that he's Emeritus Professor of English at Princeton University and New York University. Companion to World Mythology, and most recently, Tales of the Earth, and in the series Biography, a very short introduction to world mythology. There's a marvelous display back here of all David's books, as well as James Baldwin's. It was out of his work as an assistant to Baldwin from 1963 to 1967 that a lifelong friendship grew, a friendship that led of this extraordinary man. Amazing book. But right on the front from the New York Times Book Review, it says, "This is the most revealing and subjectively penetrating assessment of Baldwin's life." It is a work that combines scholarship with compassion and empathy in a very high degree. Then in 1998, Professor Leeming wrote Amazing Grace, the artist and friend of James Baldwin. One reviewer says of this biography, and bewitches us in this narrative lovingly crafted by David Leeming. So friendship are in fact the linking themes here. And it is this story of the lifelong, life-shaping friendship between James Baldwin and Beauford Delaney today. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Melinda, for that generous introduction. I'd like to dedicate this lecture tonight to Maria McCarthy, who died just a year ago today. The title of my lecture is Jimmy and Beauford, The Bond of the Invisible Door. Sorry, the unusual door. In some ways it was invisible. And by the way, if I say Beaufort and you say surely that should be Beaufort, you would be right. But in Knoxville, where Beaufort grew up, the word was pronounced. He pronounced his name Beaufort, so that's what I call him. In spite of the fact that when he moved to Paris, of course, people called him Beaufort. It was a miserable rainy day in the early winter of 1940. A 16-year-old boy with some hesitation approached a dilapidated building on Green Street in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. The boy was a senior in high school, uptown in the Bronx, and he was an apprentice preacher at a Pentecostal church in Harlem. He was downtown because he had a part-time job cleaning floors at a shop in Canal Street. The boy was on one of those end of the road missions made in depression. Depression was overwhelming him. A friend at school had told him about an eccentric painter he had met one Saturday in the village. The painter was poor, but recognized as a serious artist. He was probably a talker, and he loved giving advice. Like the troubled boy, he was African American, and already a symbol and an anomaly, a Black artist living downtown. And so the boy found his way to the Green Street door and knocked. The door opened, and the boy was confronted by he had completed his instant x-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, Delaney. As Baldwin would say later, he had come to the right door. It was the unusual door, a way to a new life, a life marked by an unbreakable bond with Beaufort. The bond of the unusual door, he called it, a bond that would in great part affect the lives of both men. As a biographer of both Baldwin and Delaney, it was important for me to learn more about the situations and personalities of these two individuals passed through that door. Worked for him, for Baldwin, and some biographical essays, such as those contained in the volume called Notes of a Native Son and The Fire Next Time. But a particularly unguarded vision of the boy at the unusual door eventually emerged in characters developed in early fictional works, especially the novel Go Tell It on the Mountain, Corner. The conflicts are all there in Go Tell It on the Mountain, where the hero, young James John Grimes, embodies the situation of young Jimmy Baldwin. In the novel, John, in early adolescence, is saved. During the same year of his salvation, he experiences sexual feelings with his new religious status. In real life and fictional life, John and Jimmy were frightened by their sexual awakenings. In both cases, there was an unsympathetic and suspicious stepfather, broken by racism and his inability to support his family. From the beginning of John's salvation experience and Jimmy Baldwin's role as an apprentice preacher, there was a sense that the church might be a repressive dead end. And both boys are driven by a longing for something new, religious and family situation, prison. In Go Tell It on the Mountain, John regularly climbs the hill in Central Park, facing at whose feet flowers would be strewn, and before whom multitudes cried Hosanna. He would be of all the mightiest, the most beloved, the Lord's anointed, and he would live in this shining city which his ancestors had seen with longing from far away. Young, drawn by the same longing. In the Amen Corner, the longing further developed would be expressed by David, the son of a preacher and poverty. David in his mother's is his mother's church musician, but he comes to believe that his music belongs elsewhere, that it must not be imprisoned by his mother's religion or his father's victory. Announcing his departure, David says to his mother, "If I stayed here, I'd end up worse than Daddy, because I wouldn't be doing what I know I got to do. I've seen your life, my work to do. Something's I know you don't think I know what's happening, but I'm beginning to see something every day I play. Every time I listen, I see Daddy's face and yours and so many faces. Who's going to speak for all that, Mama? Who's going to speak for all? I can't stay home. Maybe I can say something one day. Maybe I can say something in music that's never been said before." This speech is, of course, a projection of James Baldwin's decision to leave the church and home, to risk entering the city he and John Grimes had looked down on from the hill in Central Park. As it turned out, the door to the city was at 181 Green Street. The man on the other side of the door was a man Henry Miller called the Amazing and Invariable. Cover of a chapbook, which is quite wonderful, that Henry Miller. I think most of you know that Henry Miller was an eccentric. Well, it would take too long to talk about who Henry Miller was, but Jimmy walked through the door into Beauford's world of poverty and of ample reason for despair. A world on the surface not all that unlike his own life at home. Was somehow different. It was a world in which poverty and despair were transformed into beauty. Buford's Buddha like face radiates whatever it was that David in the Amen corner saw as the message his music might send, the hopes experienced by Jimmy and John on the Central Park mountain. In his studio, this show of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings recently in New York, there were 4 portraits that she did. She never did portraits, but she did in this case. She did 4 charcoal portraits of Beauford Delaney. Here's one of them. Beauford's apartment, with its cot and its potbelly stove and its easel, was even colder and barer than the Baldwin apartment uptown. But Jimmy was immediately aware of and amazed by the paintings that were everywhere in the room. These paintings spoke of Beauford's condition and of what art could make of that condition. In his chapbook on Delaney, Henry Miller put into words what he imagined the message of the painting to be. And this is Miller's quote. "Here I sit in Green Street," said the canvases, "and I am in God. I am the spirit of hunger for all that has been denied me, one with the street, one with the cold, dead walls. But I am not dead, neither am I cold nor yet invisible." And imagining Beauford's voice further, Miller writes, "I sit here in Green Street and I paint what I am. Aristocratic solitudes. No sun, moon, or stars, no warmth, no the lights, all the stars, all the constellations, all the angels for companions. I am Green Street as it looks from the angle." Things Buford did after he made, he knocked on the door, was to put a record on his old gramophone. Often when Jimmy visited, especially blues songs by Bessie Smith and Ethel Waters. Others. Buford sensed music. For the young Pentecostal preacher, even a doubting one, blues and jazz were sinful, associated with smoky clubs, booze, and sex. Sacredness of non-religious, uh, that, the sacredness of non-religious son. And he talked about how just as much as the composers and to lure, to bear their souls. So the world to celebrate who and what they were. Beauford reconciled for his Harlem streets and clubs with the music of the Harlem churches, and by extension, the boy's sexual awakening he associated with his artistic awakening. This was a lesson of great importance to the later writer of Sonny's Blues and the Amen Corner. From that day in 1940, James Baldwin and Beauford Delaney's lives were bonded. Years later, Jim Baldwin would say of Beauford, he was my primary witness. When Jimmy's stepfather died, Beauford found money to help the family to bury him. Beauford found Jimmy a better job, working as a dishwasher and waiter at Connie Williams' Calypso Cafe, where in after hours they would join Connie and share their troubles, sing old songs, and enjoy a drink or two. The former boy preacher, having widened his horizons on the question of sin, but most of all, between 1940 and 1948, when Baldwin left for Paris, Beauford helped him to see as a creative artist. That is, to be a true witness. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble. Taught his protege as Baldwin of his seeing caused tools. He took friends in the jazz world and he or literal gutter. Day as they were walking through Greenwich Village at the gutter they were just crossing, stopping as if in an amazing sight. The gutter, full of oil and trash, he said. Look how the oil on the surface of the water changes the buildings reflected in the water. Some 43 years later, Baldwin, pacing one afternoon in his study in Saint Paul de Vence, talked to me about that incident and what he. It was not simply a question of close observation. It had to do with a willingness to face and see through ugliness in order to find what the artist has to find. Sometimes finding whatever it is with confronting one's that what you cannot see Jimmy was complex. Beauford was in love with Jimmy. Jimmy loved Beauford, but not sexually, was not sexually in love with him. Furthermore, Beaufort required permanence, a place to live and paint. Jimmy never completely lost his preacher identity. He would spend his life from the 1940s on, moving from place to place, writing to be sure, but always searching for a new venue for the preaching of his own gospel. The complexity of the bond of the unusual door is reflected in the 1941 painting to which Beaufort gave the title Dark Rapture. It's possible that he was thinking of the 1931 documentary of that same name about explorations of the Belgian Congo. In the case, it was almost certainly the young James about nudity portraits. Yet here was a 16 or 17. The fact that Baldwin gave the painting as indicated that Beaufort gave the painting as indicated by an inscription to a close friend of Baldwin's, probably a lover, says as much about a recognition that dark rapture represented by young Jimmy was not to be his, but belonged to someone else. And there's much more I could tell you about this painting, but it could be the only subject of the lecture, so I think I'll pass on that. The fact that Beaufort gave this painting, as I tell you, as I said, indicates that it was an act of love, but not an act of love that involved his relationship with Jimmy himself. In 1948, was devastated. For several years, he told friends he hoped to visit Paris to see Jimmy. In 1953, the visit became possible. So began the second stage of the bond of the unusual door. Since the days when Jimmy and Beaufort had spent time together in Greenwich Village, much reputation as an abstract painter periodically jeered at him. Is found in Notes of a Native Son, depression, and was increasingly focused on the racial situation at home. Baldwin described his meeting on the painter's first day in Paris in 1953. He was sitting with a friend at the Café Flore, and he saw a familiar shape in the street between the Flore and the Brasserie Lippe. Baldwin rushed out of the floor shouting Beaufort's name, and they met in the middle of the street in an ecstatic embrace, hours or horns honking all around them. But in the 25 years between 53 and his death, he only returned to the States once for a short Christmas visit to Knoxville in 1969. Beaufort was falling in love with Paris, and he continued to be in love with Jimmy. This is an example of this is an example of many portraits that he did. There was a window that looked at the garden behind the house in Clermont. Baldwin said, moaning and wailing when it rained, black and bitter when it thundered, hesitant and delicate with the first light of morning, and as blue as the blues when the last light of the sun departed. The two old friends would sit for hours in front of that window, drinking and talking. Jimmy said that it was in front of that window that he really began to understand the centrality of light in Beauford's paintings. Baldwin saw that light as a religious light, a light that, quote, held the power to illuminate, even to read. Beauford's old role as Jimmy's mentor had changed. It was Beauford now who depended on his younger friend for guidance and support, especially as his mental state had become more tenuous. Beauford discussed his inner life in one letter with the many people who make and trying to merge them into some sort of composition and a workable form of painting. Here for a great many odd placement picture. End of quote. In December of 1961, Baldwin flew to Istanbul to visit a friend. It happened that I was there at the time teaching. I met Baldwin at a party, and so began. He received a letter from Beauford describing his attempted suicide in Greece, more demanding, suggesting that Beauford was a useless freak and that he might as well end it all. Jimmy decided he had better return to Paris to spend Christmas with his old friend. Later, he would write to another friend about Beauford's inner world as he saw it. He wondered whether Beauford's growing up in the South had made him too accommodating to the white world in which he had lived and on which he depended for the acceptance of his paintings. It would humble his enemy, voices that tortured him. Baldwin's introduction to the catalog for 1964 Galerie Lambert Delaney retrospective, he spoke of his old mentor as his. It was Beauford who taught him to confront reality, but it was also Beauford who taught him that art can only be born of love, and that, quote, no greater lover had ever held a brush, unquote. True, Beauford life was sad, even tragic, but his art was a blues song. In the summer of 66, I found myself at Beauford Delaney's unusual door. I'd been working for Baldwin in his. He had escaped to write a novel for Baldwin. Car in Paris. Jimmy asked me to pick up Beauford there and to bring him to Istanbul. I was a cross between Brer Rabbit and St. Francis of Assisi. That's all you need to know. Just don't lose him. And so I found my way and climbed the stairs to his door. A note on the door said, I knocked, and a warm come in. When I immediately that I had entered what was for me a and the sun seemed to float in all, as if to usual door. The face Beauford head to head. We stayed there 3 days and nights, except in the hall outside window. And we talked about everything. You participating in a major interview, two biographies that I like this one. On the they announced we can go to Jimmy now. The continuation of life behind the usual door. Jimmy, nothing about his attempt. He did not warn me of our fast moving car, which he did me not to lose him. By that, when I did, in fact, assigned to cots near each other in a transit hotel for people passing through the Iron Curtain in those days. That Beauford's was not in his cot. I found him in the village and with difficulty convinced him, realizing there was only one way of getting us. And several nights in each other's arms. It was not an experience of sexual passion, culmination of a lesson I me to learn when he sent me to Istanbul. He knew that I and the world I represented needed took personal form in his hallucinations and sometimes drove him literally mad, even almost to death. In Istanbul, we all shared a house, and eventually Beaufort flew back to Paris. But before he did, now, Millie, are you there? Is Millie there? I can't make the. Before he did, he painted this 6 in Istanbul. in Istanbul, in Paris, in St. Paul at the end of the 60s. Took him back to Istanbul. At one point, Dr. Pangloss, who ended up in the 1954 introduction of Beauty was a black blue midnight full of sorrow. And I do not know what kind of strength these and 70s. He struggled hard, using paint and canvas to hold off the relentless voices. His sense, his series of Rosa Parks paintings are a reprise of his early Greenwich Village painting of the African American heroes such as Marian Anderson and Ethel Waters. In one painting, Rosa sits alone on a bench, and in the other, a white woman, perhaps a kind of yellow abstractions were a celebration that allowed him to go on living. Some of Beauford's friends, including James Baldwin, arranged it with the gallery owner for a Delaney retrospective in 1973. In the catalog, James Baldwin wrote, quote, when such that a trusteeship, including Baldwin, agreed Paris. Baldwin visited on March 26, 19, suffering from remained in St. Paul with the pain of Beauford's passing bottled up inside. For the at not having attended Beauford's funeral in Paris. This was his worst moment, he said, and he later admitted that he had acted like a spoiled child, somehow angry at his spiritual father for dying without his permission. At the end of his own life, Baldwin was working on a novel about Beaufort, which he never finished. During his final days, sitting up with him in Beaufort's Montparnasse, bowed back through the unusual door. Darkness, and I would answer. The station was about Beaufort. Jimmy's voice was often an angry voice. At his funeral, Amiri Baraka called him, quote, Black revolutionary, but it was a mouth and a voice tempered and made more powerful by the love and light of Beauford Delaney's concept. And I'd be happy to answer. I'm sorry I had some trouble reading because of sort of an eye problem I have. Yes. In that heavy brush strokes, and then on on that surface, he did what was almost a line of Baldwin's face. Yellow was definitely his color. Yes. But this is changing. Not only the line said, "Won't you lie down?" and so lie down. And I realized right away, but that there must be a reason for it, and possible reason, especially some really upsetting. I mean, I was too young, and which he insisted on. He was still in this. He was convinced that the voices event. Okay, that question had to do with. Uh, we did eat some tuna fish, a lot of tuna fish. I've never was next. Oh, hi, Maria. Novels were. I went through all of his. Before he died, he asked me to go because when I worked for him in New York, the novel about Beauford Delaney had. There were several titles. He always liked writing titles first, and and I can't remember exactly what the dictable notes, the Greenwich, his own visiting Beaufort and behind the unusual door. Yes, Doug. Given all of the ah, if I had more paintings here, I could show you more easily than describing it. But the paintings often do reflect something of his mental state. Okay, there was a retrospective. Well, first of all, when he died, his brother, who was also a painter, Joseph Delaney, went from Knoxville to Paris and got permission from the French government. He did, and he brought them back to Knoxville. And then there was a retrospective show at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Uh, with a friend who was an art dealer to take them back down to Knoxville. Um, so they were all protected. I mean, some were. Buford spent part of his first year a lot of charcoal drawings, apparently. But when he came to New York with those paintings, and he went to and the people in the apartment said there are no paintings. So all of those paintings were lost to the museum. Um, it answers the question. There's a guy through the estate. The estate owns the painting and sold, and many have been. Um, Isabel Gallery is the gallery you have to go through if you want to buy a painting. A lot now. In Buford's day, if he, well, first of all, he would never sell a painting unless he liked the person who came to look at the paintings. So they'd come and look, and he'd say, "I don't have any paintings," uh, even though he was dying of poverty. But if he liked the person, he would take the white sheets, which I had seen when I first went there. You might get $100 at the most. I don't think he ever made personally more than $200 for a painting. Now insurance, well, they're very expensive. About her doing the portrait, the question is were done by Georgia recently in the MoMA show. He, Buford had people love him, and he spent a lot of time at the place. That was his last gallery. And he got to know O'Keeffe and Stieglitz and Steichen and John Marin and Arthur Dove. He got to know lots and lots of the great modernist painters of his period. And George portrait. Supposedly he painted one of her, but I've never been able to find it. It's interesting that as much as they loved him, they never offered a place to show his painting. For black artists at that time, nobody said time he got to different artists. Well, yes. Did he? Paris in 1953, he went with the idea of staying for a month, and he stayed on brief visit home to Knoxville. But in Paris, there was a bear run by Dorothy Aspire. Several people who in Paris, several didn't. Yes. And I don't know who took it. I do actually, but I don't know. He was a friend of Baldwin's, and he went on this particular visit to St. Anne's Hospital for the Insane in Paris. I love this painting, this because Baldwin looks so proud of him, and yet this man would had been his mentor and his salvation really as a child. He changed at the end. Jimmy his finances. His name was, as I remember, Max Petrus. But oh, right. The question is, uh, when did I decide that I was going to actually write a biography? Okay, I think it was in the 70s. In 76 or something, I can't remember. I went up to Amherst. We saw each other quite a lot. And I thought, well, you know, I went up to Amherst where he was teaching, which he did for half of almost every year in his late years, stay home. And I said, would you give me a letter giving me permission to write a biography? And he had, as somebody pointed out, or did I point it out, that he used to call me his Boswell as a kind of joke, but I didn't really take it seriously. But then I guess I began to take it seriously. And I said, all right, I'd like to write the biography. And so he gave me a letter saying I should have access to his papers. And I had already sorted out all of his start. And I didn't really start writing it 3 Nights with Beauford Delaney, which the Beauford Delaney biography. I started interviewing him too. I mean, I went because Pam and I were living in Cassis. It's only a short distance from to Nice, which is where what above Nice, up the mountain. Him several times there. Again, would be supportive of it. Frankly, to me about all sorts. That's how. Yes, Belinda. Right. This book is available in paperback. It went out of print very briefly. You get if you go to inexpensively. Um, Delaney, it's called Amazing Grace, a Life. It has been for some time. There's a reprint being made that would be ready for today. And it has an introduction by Hilton. So if you're interested in a few months, it should be ready. Um, the, um, it won't cost you anything. What?